So first module, Chris, of DP-201 will drill down into the architectural design considerations around Azure.
Yeah, absolutely.
Tell us more about that.
Yeah, so this is general architecture considerations around Azure. It's not just about data and AI, right? So first of all, we're going to talk about the pillars of a great Azure architecture, and actually they're the next 4 lessons.
Yep.
So the great pillars being designing with security, considering performance and scalability, designing for availability and recovery, and designing for efficiency and operations, right?
Yep.
And then we finish off by looking through the case study, which we want your students at least 10 minutes to really digest that, and we'll come to that when we get to it.
And so what we do in the case study is not only around the overall architecture design, it's also around the designing for the data optimization, everything that comes into play around that as well.
Yeah, so you're using the case study as a basis for these driving decisions around architecture choices, right? Which is why this particular module will have a lab that's group-based, not individually based, because the learning is actually with the groups.
Makes sense.
Okay.
One of the things to call out for our trainers, I think, as well, is around this case study. So when I task the team around, hey, I want this to be case study centric across the data and AI curriculum, the idea would be is that we have the flexibility to later on swap out these case studies with industry specific.
Exactly.
This one's based around AdventureWorks, Logic. Everyone that has been a DBA knows AdventureWorks as one of the sample databases, right? And now that evolution into that entire digital transformation strategy makes sense.
Yeah.
But of course, when we work with some of these dedicated trainings, there's customization opportunities around this case study that applies to healthcare, finance, you name it as well.
Absolutely. So for the senior trainers within a learning partner who may go out and just do a bit more than just training, they may actually go out and do like custom training engagements where they're really looking at the customer's situation and tailoring training around that. You could quite literally replace the case study with your customers' requirements and help to build up an architecture with your customers, and that would offer tremendous value to them.
Yeah, and I think that also gives the opportunity is for us more senior trainers that have done a lot of this architecture and design to kind of get into this community contribution motion where they could share and then apply those to the Azure well-designed reference architectures.
Yeah, absolutely.
That we do have in place. Okay, that makes sense.
So with the first lesson, you're looking at the pillars of great Azure architectures, and it's not just about data and AI, it's with architectures in general. You know, you'll find in DP-201 there's a lot less slides per module than there was with DP-200. Because the idea is really you're facilitating, right? You're guiding, and the time should be spent in the labs, in groups to work on the key components of what you're teaching to deliver that. So with pillars of great Azure architectures, you know, you will be discussing with them the fact that security is really important, right? And it should always be at the forefront of your mind. And that, you know, at the end of the day, if your systems are not performing, then your customers are going to just disappear. So you need to think about that as well. Disaster recovery, what availability and recovery options do you need to consider that meets both business and maybe technical requirements? And finally, efficiency in operations.
So when we think about these labs, I think you mentioned something that, hey, as a trainer, you'll be a facilitator. The way I feel that, where in a traditional, you're going through a hands-on lab and it's a lot of this like students' time behind their machine, configuring and implementing things. Having done a lot of these whiteboard design sessions and so on, it actually feels and is that you're going to be busier during the lab time than you would be in an implementation course, right?
Probably, especially if you've had someone on the course who's not done DP-200. If they haven't done DP-200, you're probably going to get a lot of people during the labs going, not quite sure what this technology does. So that's why the prerequisites of Azure Fundamentals and DP-200 is really, really important.
And then would you put people into like smaller groups and have them work together?
Yeah, so there's directions in the lab for how big the group should be, but we're talking about 4 or 5 people, and we can discuss that when we get to the lab in more depth. So talk to them that these are the pillars of great Azure architectures, not just for data and AI, for Azure as a whole. And then you've got security. And security is a multi-layered approach. So ultimately what you're doing is you're protecting the data, but surrounding that is physical security, because, you know, Some hacks are done just through social engineering and keeping the door open for someone while they get into your building. Identity.
It's going to be really hard in an Azure data center, though.
It will be, definitely, especially when our execs can't get in there. Identity and access is the second thing, how people verify their identity and what resources they can access. Perimeter security, how you're going to deal with that from a firewall configuration, so forth. Network layer, what kind of networking you're going to do, what kind of encryption protocols you're going to use there, how you're going to protect the compute, what application layer security you're going to provide, and ultimately, what data. Now, you're probably going to be very familiar with the data security already, but the point we're making here is that really, when it comes to architectures, you've got to take a very holistic view of things. You can't just look at the data, you've got to look at the wider world.
Yeah, makes sense.
Okay. So then we look at performance and scalability, give a definition of what scaling is and what performance is, and talk about some of the patterns and practices that can be used to help with that. So we've got partitioning, which can occur on SQL, data warehouse, Cosmos DB, and also SQL database as well. You've got scaling, which, all the major
scaling
platforms.
Of compute, throughput, you name it.
Exactly. And don't forget as well, there's caching capabilities as well. We've got CDN that you could use to cache content to speed things up there.
Makes sense.
Okay. From that, availability and recoverability, let's talk about the definitions of each of these. Because you do go on consulting engagements where sometimes you have to explain the difference between availability and recoverability to people. So make that distinction very, very early on. And also talk about, in recoverability, the importance and the distinction between restore point objectives versus restore time objectives.
And this is primarily all focused around our Azure Data Services in terms of availability, recoverability.
Exactly. So in
replicas.
So in DP-200, if you remember, there is a separate module in this that looks at the different recoverability times for different data platforms, right?
Sense.
So, for example, Cosmos DB
versus SQL DB.
Exactly,
versus,
and that determines your restore point objective and your recovery time
makes
objective.
sense.
And then you've got efficiency and operations, right? So why is it important? It's really important, especially to your managers within an IT department. So, how does the cloud help improve that efficiency? Capital expenditure versus operational, OPEX and CAPEX, as we call it. Efficiency best practices, so how can we do cost optimization through auto-scaling and so forth. And operational best practices, right? Automate as much as possible. What can you do to make life easier for you? Can we automate recoverability? Can we automate deployments? That kind of thing. And then finally, to kind of provide the focus for the 2 days of this course, we have the actual case study itself. Now, there's two options that you can do here. The suggestion is you can allocate 10 minutes to read through the case study individually, but I would recommend that actually it's probably better if you go through this as a group. So spend at least 10 minutes going through this.
That makes sense.
Okay. The lab is on architecture considerations. You've just got to bear in mind, you've just spent 10 to 15 minutes going through the case study, right? That provides the overarching view of the world. So it's the kind of information that you probably gathered in a discovery workshop. What you're now going to do in this lab is use the information gained in this module with the case study to look at the core principles of creating architectures and how that can be applied with that case study in mind. So you're going to look at designing with security in mind, look at specific examples of how you can embed performance and scalability. You'll also describe potential availability recovery options, and finally, efficiency and operations, right? So in this particular lab, we've got we haven't got a one-to-one mapping with the lesson. We're doing 4 of them.
Yeah, so that kind of feels like when you look at his entire case study, it's kind of like peeling down an onion and then going into each of the layers around security design.
That is really important, right? Because that is going back to the holistic point, right? That you've got to look at everything. So the scenario just drills down a little bit more context in conjunction with the case study. And as you can see in the first line of the second paragraph there is working in a group. So we're advising that you have groups of 4 to 5 people. I think 4 is
smaller
ideal.
classes, even 3. Would
if you've only got like 6 people on a class, 2 groups of 3 will Really, really nice.
Yeah, and I think as a trainer, there's a lot of things you can do there to really encourage that level of collaboration.
Exactly.
And that's the excitement and engagement you need to bring when you're delivering these.
Yeah, and don't be afraid to separate up people from the same company if they're willing to do that, right?
Yeah.
Because the point, if you have everyone from the same company, they do get the benefit that it allows them to focus on their company.
Yep.
Unfortunately, what they miss out on is the opportunity of that cross-pollination from someone who
Totally
doesn't
agree.
work for
And
them.
I would actually split them up.
Exactly, but that's where we have the lab reviews, where in this particular course, lab reviews are more important than in any of the data engineering courses.
And do you see those lab reviews as a kind of like a present back? What did you find?
Definitely.
It's kind of like, hey, show me your flip chart.
Exactly.
Your 10-minute, 20-minute whiteboard design outcome. Yep.
And the thing with this is we have provided very, very in-depth instructor notes in the lab to help you guide it. I would highly recommend that you read those instructor notes because they are very in-depth. What we're putting in there is how you should guide the classroom, right? Okay. And what you'll find is a recurring theme. Yep. What you're trying to do in your lab review is you're trying to understand what the groups come up with and if there are any gaps, because if one group picks up on something that another group doesn't, you can kind of use that.
You want to bring them back by the end of the module. Everyone should be understanding what was discussed.
Exactly.
Be able to like see where they were missing gaps in the overall design.
Exactly.
That totally makes sense.
And we're not leaving you alone there because the instructor notes for the labs are very, very thorough.
Okay, perfect.
So in the lab review, it is exactly as you just said, it's really about reviewing the various answers that the groups have got. And the second point is identifying and exploring any gaps that there may be between groups. If you look at the instructor notes that we provide in, they're very, very thorough. It'll also lead you to direct what the things that you're kind of looking for. It could be that the group completely misses the point and you may have to bring them on speed. Are there any requirements that couldn't be categorised? That's to do with a specific question that's asked in this lab. And are there any requirements that would require input from other roles? An example of that would be maybe you're undertaking an AI transformation project with a bot. You're probably going to want to liaise with a marketing department there because at the end of the day, the bot is representing your organisation.
And so that could go into things like also stakeholder management, where you're going to have to work with multiple stakeholders across the business, or you're going to have to work with a data scientist to say, hey, for this specific case, we probably need a data scientist or an AI engineer to build out that solution.
Exactly. Okay. And then as the module review, just go through what you've just covered. And we highly recommend that you direct the students to the Microsoft Customer Case Study site. This shows some really good case studies by industry where they can find like-minded organisations that are doing similar things. Okay.
Sounds
and that wraps up the first module.
Okay, perfect. So, let's get back and go to the next module then.
Sure.